Welcome to another edition of Fight Back Interviews, the About Fraud series that shines a light on the people, the passions, and the human stories driving our industry forward. And to provide this content, we need some kick-ass supporters. This Fight Back interview is powered by Sardine. Sardine is a behavior-based fraud and compliance platform. It helps merchants, marketplaces, and financial institutions fight fraud using data, machine learning, and decades of experience to build capabilities that detect zero-day scams, fraud, and sophisticated criminal activity. Join the fraud squad by heading to sardine.ai. Now, let's get into it. Hey, Peter, how are you doing today?
I am doing great.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us for our Fraud Fight Back interview series. This is something we've been doing a bit more of recently. This is episode number 4, I believe, and we're really excited to have you here. There's a ton I want to dive into, so I'm not going to do any more of an intro other than asking you to intro yourself.
Yeah, all right. Well, Peter Tapling, I am Managing Director of PTAP Advisory, independent consultancy operating at the intersection of payments, fraud, and innovation.
Now that was awesome and super concise, which I appreciate. So I think one of the interesting things for me is when I became familiar with your work, I was like, man, this guy is a payments expert, which is true. But your foundation is in fraud and authentication. So I'm curious, especially as a fraud fighter, how you got started in the world of authentication and fraud.
Yeah, that's a fair question. And it's interesting, like nobody ever graduates. There's no 5-year-olds that say, I want to be a fraud fighter when I grow up. Long ago and far away, my propeller used to spin quickly. I was an application developer. I became in charge of an application development tool that way back when did something we called role-based authentication, which was providing certain people access to certain capabilities in certain fields on certain screens. How do you do role-based authentication? Well, you need to know who the person is. And so that was kind of that, trickled me into identity, even though I thought I was just a run-of-the-mill application developer. And then once you start working in identity, it turns out that anytime money moves, we care about who moves the money. Fast forward a little bit, I was in the PKI space, all the stuff around asymmetric key cryptography, got into a few payments-related industry work groups. At the time, Nacha, the rule maker for the ACH here in the United States, had a group called the Internet Council, and they were trying to educate payments professionals on PKI. What was all this stuff around digital certificates? And that kind of got me sucked into the payments universe and founded a couple of companies. And those companies served people, financial institutions, and people who were processing payments. And there's a reason my consulting practice operates at that intersection, because you really can't talk about one without talking about the other.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue into what I want to get into. And I like how you just dropped in, founded a couple companies, as we all do. But one of the ones you founded, I believe, was acquired by Early Warning. Is that correct?
Yes. So we founded Authentify. Authentify, we're the people who invented out-of-band authentication as you know it. So every time you get one of those annoying 6-digit pins to support a login, you can blame me. We came up with that idea very early, back in the days when SMS messages cost 25 cents to send and 12 cents to receive. So in the early days, it was always phone calls. But for any of you or your listeners who remember, back in the day when you used to try and reset a web-based password, you would get a message that says, "Thank you very much, we'll mail you a PIN." That was at least 3 days. And so getting a telephone call on your kitchen phone that said your PIN number is 9734 was way faster than 3 days.
Yeah. No,
and then keeping the startup theme, and then of course we pivoted. We did a lot of pivots, and over the course of 18 years at Authentify, we created a mobile authenticator that looks most familiar to things like Microsoft Authenticator and Google Authenticator. We created a multiple authenticator, and then eventually Early warning had a vision of creating a bank identity, and on the basis of that, acquired Authentify and all the assets. Fortunately or unfortunately, right after that, they acquired the assets to create what became Zelle. So the identity stuff kind of got put to the side, and I was chief revenue officer for early warning during the launch of Zelle, which again turns me deep into the payment space.
And into the payments to the where I kind of, looked at the resume and everything I knew about you from recent history, and it was payments, 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 payments. And on that point, early warning, you mentioned Nacha, you're on the U.S. Faster Payments Council, so you're knee deep, maybe elbow or neck deep in payments.
Yeah, probably
So,
like
so
right up to there.
and what I'm going to ask might seem like an easy answer because, when you look at faster payments, how much do scams actually concern you? So, like, it's just the biggest topic in fraud, which is scams, which is so deep in the number of scams. But knowing everything about our payments infrastructure and the susceptibility of scams, even with slower payments, how concerned are you?
I will say, near term, moderately concerned. Longer term, less concerned. I think we'll get better at this. We have 40 years of history trying to build fraud capabilities to address unauthorized transactions. And what we did not expect, when products like Zelle were brought to market, the idea was that for a consumer, they want access to their money as quickly as possible. As a financial institution, you want to give them access to that money as quickly as possible. Well, hey, let's create something that moves money from bank account to bank account and does so instantly, but only does so if you tell me to do it, right? Hey, sounds like a great product. Well, bad guys showed up and they thought, well, I could take a gun and walk into a bank branch and say, hold them up and I'll get $10,000. Or I can ask 100,000 people to give me money and some non-zero percentage of them will.
Yeah.
And so the real challenge that we have is we're almost trying to protect people from themselves. We've had to do this before, right? Cash. I remember when I grew up with cash, my father would give me $20 for whatever it was I was going to be doing. He's just make sure you don't give this to the wrong people, right? And so we have to take that physical world coaching that a parent gives a child of don't give this to the wrong people and figure out ways to do that in this digital universe.
Absolutely. And I'm going to get more into like scam education and kind of cracking that nut because that is a big part of course, technology, data, the people and processes that help us protect banks, merchants, all different social platforms. There's so much we can do from a B2B standpoint to help protect these people when they fall for scams, but being proactive so they don't fall for scams and an education standpoint seems like a huge gap, but I will get into that in just a second. So you mentioned, when it comes to scams and authorized. So authorized push payment fraud, as it's often called in the UK, is something that is tracked and measured by UK finance. So I'm conscious they have way less banks than we do, right? So and they rolled out faster payments a lot earlier than us. So I think they felt the pain of the scams and they've worked on kind of consistently defining it and tracking it. So in the US, I don't see, that reporting. I see the self-reporting, which is okay, but it's way underreported. And I see the Fed doing some good stuff with fraud definitions and scam definitions. But I guess from your position, is there an organization or entity that could do something similar to UK finance and get into the reporting and the tracking of scams so we can measure this better?
Yeah, we don't have an entity like UK Finance or CFAS, that is another one in the UK, Payments Canada up in Canada, which are organizations who are built to intentionally aggregate this information for reporting purposes. So we don't have anything like that. The good news is you mentioned the Federal Reserve activities. The Fed had two work groups going on, had one. Well, they have had two. One of them just completed their effort, the Scams Definitions Work Group. And that's important because you manage what you measure and you can only measure what you can count. And so that by having a definition and a way that organizations can categorize events as being this type of event, and now let's put that in a bucket. Now we have the capability to at least categorize things. The second work group is the scams information sharing work group. And so the second work group, I participate in that with the Fed. And that second work group is really focused on, once we've defined these things, now how do we count them? How do we share information? Sharing information can be, this happened. Sharing information could be, this is about to happen. We should stop it and slow it down, right?
Yeah.
That second one's kind of another level of maturity. But to get to your question of how do we count them, it requires people to be willing to contribute, hey, this happened. One of the things that you said that I really want to make sure we put a point on is the underreporting of scam activity. There is an organization called IC3, the Internet Crime Complaint Center, operated by the FBI. Any citizen of the United States is able to go in and say, hey, this happened to me. Customers go to their financial institutions and they say, hey, this happened to me. Because we haven't had good definitions, sometimes that fell into fraud, sometimes that fell into other types of losses and just don't end up getting reported as scams. And I think most importantly, there are certain people who realize losses from scams and through embarrassment say nothing. And this is everything from a person who might have had thought that they bought a ticket to a baseball game outside the stadium, and it turns out that the ticket was no good, up to businesses who get business email compromise scammed for $50, $70, $100,000, but they're able to absorb the loss, and they just don't want to bring any attention to themselves. Well, we will spend money to solve problems that are obvious problems. The problem becomes more obvious if everyone reports.
Yes, and breaking the stigma of, listen, just because you fall for a scam doesn't mean you're stupid or, it's only vulnerable populations or less tech-savvy folks. We have to get past that and normalize the fact that we're in a different era than even 5-10 years ago.
Yeah, well, and by the way, reducing the stigma of reporting after the fact also reduces the stigma of talking about it upstream, right? Definitely. And so we talk all the time about this idea of, one of the things fraudsters try to do in a scam scenario is they try and isolate the target, right? They try and say, oh, this is really important. Don't tell anyone. You can't use your phone, right? Well, if we can get people reporting that this happened, we can break that stigma and say, hey, if somebody tells me if my bank calls me and says, don't tell anybody else about this, that should raise the antennae and say, this is something wrong.
Yeah, and this shouldn't be shocking with human psychology and human nature. You see people being manipulated in all different types. There's documentaries on cults and, all kinds of other reasons we make decisions we do. And then you look back and you're like, why did I do that? It's usually emotionally, there's an emotional component, there's a psychological component, and so we're a lot more complex than hopefully we like to think and just say, hey, I make all rational decisions, right?
Yeah, let's go with that.
Yeah. So I think and here's another thing. I think the average citizen, and I was this before I got into fraud and a little bit into payments, was, they look at fraud protections through the card lens, not the ACH wire P2P lens, where the fraud protections are very different. Do you think there's a way to educate folks on that, on the difference in what they're protected against and what they're not?
I'm always troubled with this question. Yes, I think there's a way to educate them, but I think it's the wrong way to go about it, right? That's basically like saying we're going to take everybody who drives a car and we're going to help them understand ignition timing with their carburetor. That's not the problem they're trying to solve. Yeah. What we really need to do is we in the payments industry need to get better at telling people what are the characteristics of this payment. This car will go, 25 miles to the gallon. It will reach a top speed of 120 miles an hour. It will do these things, right? So for instance, a credit card, and by the way, in 30, 40 years, we've been terrible at getting consumers to understand the difference between a debit card and a credit card, right? I mean, think about that. But in a credit card where credit is a product, I am be given the right to spend money that I might not actually have at the moment, and somebody is going to offer me credit to do that, is a very different product than a debit card, right? Where the money's going to come straight out of my account. I think we have late millennial, Gen Z. I think we have generations who are kind of scared away from credit. People who grew up when their parents were living through 2008 through 2010. We don't want a credit card. They understand this difference between money comes straight out of my account or this is something that I'm going to owe on at a later point in the future. And so I think that without having a disastrous economic event that causes all kinds of trauma to people, we need to figure out how to articulate to people, these are the characteristics of this payment. With these characteristics, this is the way it's going to behave, right? We're all familiar with, hey, what happens if I get the non-refundable fare on an airline, or what happens if I prepay for a hotel room? Well, if you don't show up, you don't get your money back. That's part of the deal. We need to be better at explaining what's the deal with this payment.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Kind of describing the nature of these payment. Get a little bit more specific than it's just. And good point on credit versus debit. So that we might be banging our head against the wall on this one. But
one other thought that I have on this concept of card networks versus other networks. Anybody who operates in the card universe, just go. People can do this. Any of your listeners can do this. Go research the Visa operating rules or the MasterCard operating rules. And you got 200 or 300 pages of rules, and you have to remember there's multiple people in that ecosystem. There's an issuing bank, and there's a card holder, and there's a merchant bank, and there's a merchant. And the liability, the risk is spread amongst all of them, right? One of the challenges with bank payments is it's just you and your bank, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the two of you is going to absorb the risk. So, we're not going to, when you do an ACH payment, you're not going and reading the Nacha operating rules to figure out, what your rights are. You just have this feeling that, if I pick up the phone and call the bank and say, something's wrong with this payment, something good's going to happen. Well, that something good that's going to happen is because in the 200-page Nacha operating rules, there's rules around how the financial institution needs to treat the customer.
Yeah.
But I think that, when we talk about pay by bank and we're going to start using instant payments and ACH payments to do point of sale transactions, I think those capabilities will be marginal until broader ecosystems get built around those that create rule sets that help everybody understand what the basis of the bargain is.
That makes a lot of sense. And this is payment education, moving into scam education, which is harder in certain ways. So these scams, people are basically with the more sophisticated ones, they're brainwashed. They are all in. Trying to break somebody out of that spell, so to speak, is really hard. So, a text message from your bank saying, hey, look out for these scams, an email from your bank, maybe a public service announcement, I feel like are not enough, and we're not getting creative enough in kind of the digital age we live. So I'm going to have a little outside the box idea, which I really think will work. It's just really hard to execute. So it's an idea called scamfluencers, and it's matching well-known people, influencers and celebrities, people actually listen to, with scam experts, and give them that platform to educate the masses. Now, I don't know if it's a TikTok video, if it's a tweet, if it's something else like that, but I would think the higher we get as this being like a social, really humanity issue of people who are losing life-changing amounts of money, going through psychological trauma, some taking their own lives from scams, that people who have a more prominent platform can and should be using these platforms to get these announcements out. I know they do them for other educational campaigns and physical diseases and all kinds of other ones. So am I slightly crazy, or am I onto something here?
Well, you're totally crazy, but let's set that aside for a moment. No, I don't think you're crazy. It's a lot about awareness. We in the fraud fighting community talk an enormous amount about scams, but it's a little bit of an echo chamber. We're talking to ourselves about things that we all know, right? If it looked like I was looking down at my phone, I was, because I wanted to show you that. I'm not sure if you can see it with my ring light there.
Yeah, it says hello from a
Yeah,
number.
exactly. And what people don't understand is that's where it starts.
Yep.
I get that text message and I say, oh, I'm sorry, you must have the wrong number. And these people are very good at this psychological, this psychoanalysis, reel people in. Oh, I'm sorry, I was looking for Sarah. Sarah who? Boom, boom, boom. You start that conversation. The one that scares me the most, and you commented, people unfortunately harming themselves, in the worst case, taking their own life. You think of pig butchering. Like, it's one thing to say, hey, give me $500 and I'll send you 5 white puppies, and you don't get the white puppies. It's another thing to take a 75-year-old person that's at the beginning of their retirement and emptying out their retirement account. If you read those stories, if you again, echo chamber, we understand this. It takes months. They cultivate that relationship for months. They exchange money value with that party for months until they do the bust out. And so it's during those months where that party has an opportunity to do something, right? And interact with anyone. But we're having this conversation amongst us. Robert Downey Jr., Taylor Swift, whomever is not the party saying, hey, if you have this kind of problem, feel free to reach out to someone. We have a suicide prevention hotline. We do not have a scam prevention hotline.
Yeah, and you can, yes, does your bank know more about scams? Do experts know more about it? But like you said, we don't have those networks. And for better or worse, people listen to people maybe that aren't the experts about things, but it's somebody they're emotionally tied to. They follow them. They're a great athlete. They're a great stinger. They're just great in whatever way they love them. And they speak these human interest kind of campaigns they do are out there. So, I mean, the more scams and pig butchering and transnational crime, and once it reaches the level of, I think, the public that that gets policy maybe moving forward, I would think people would latch on to these opportunities. So,
so the answer is yes, you're crazy, but you're the best kind of crazy.
Crazy ideas, can work out every now and then. So we have a few more minutes. I'm going to, ask a kind of just a silly question, but I know payments and fraud intersect a bunch. You talk about payments and fraud, but gun to your head, you could only talk about one for the rest of your life. Would it be payments or would it be fraud?
Boy, that's a trick question. I would say payments, only because you can never have a payments conversation without talking about fraud. So I'll get to talk about the other one anyway.
Good answer. Fair enough. And the last question I ask all my guests is about kind of the title of this segment, which is Fight Back interviews. So, fraud is complex. It's ever changing. It's kind of a beast and a challenge and a grind. You're at a point in your career where you're doing amazing kind of education and consulting on it, but I guess throughout your career, when you were starting out in authentication and fraud, and as you mentioned, kind of weaving and going different directions with that startup, what kept you motivating to keep fighting it back and creating technology to solve these problems, or consulting to solve these problems?
You never feel, at the end of the day, you never feel like you helped someone with a payment. Yes, money's going to move. The great thing about payments, by the way, some very, very high 90% of all payments for all businesses and consumers work. They work flawlessly. They deliver the value proposition they were intended to deliver. And so one of the challenges we have is we're really fighting against this tiny fraction of payments, and we're trying to take the big chunk of payments and not make them so onerous that we ruined everybody's experience to try and protect, this tiny fraction. But to your question, you never feel like you helped somebody with a payment, but if you can stop a fraud, you really feel like you helped someone, right? You protected someone. And so, when we talk about scams, they're like, oh, you asked me the question earlier, oh, they're brand new. Anybody that worked for a financial institution that worked in a wire room has had the Aunt May problem, where Aunt May has a brand new paramour from the Philippines that's going to fly over. He just needs $50,000 so that he can start his journey. And when Aunt May walks into into the bank and says, I want to wire this $50,000, people, human interaction, try to slow her down. They say, hey, wait a minute, like this, we don't think this is right. Well, what does Aunt May do? You're trying to ruin my life. This is my new husband. You're slowing me down. It's my money. You need to give it to me. And so we've had these problems for a really long time, but the fastest ways to move money was wires, and wires went through the wire room, right? Which slowed things down. So one of the things we're going to need to start looking at in payments to help fraud is, again, that basis of the bargain. We spent a lot of time with FedNow and RTP talking about instant payments. It's going to be instant. Well, you know what? Sometimes it might not be instant. We're going to slow it down in an effort to try and protect you.
Yeah, no, I mean, scams, if I misspoke, scams have been around forever. The recent surge in speed of payments just makes them a more attractive avenue, as opposed to having to go to somebody's house to scam them, or in person, or whatever it is. It's just it's scaled the landscape that they can attack from, and the speed and the monetization. So 100%, and then protecting someone, which I think was pretty much your answer, like being able to kind of have that, see what impact you made by stopping that fraud and helping that person is good a reason as any for fighting.
We all like to feel like we did something good.
Yeah, and we all kind of want to be the watch superhero movies and be the person who helps and saves people. In every job, you can't quite connect the dots on how that's happening. I
have my cape and my superhero mask right there.
There you go. Well, that's a perfect note to end on, Peter the Superhero. And thank you so much for joining me for our Fraud Fight Back interview. It was awesome getting to know you a little bit better, getting to know your fraud and payments experience a little bit better. And thank you for all that you do, Peter.
EJ, thank you for having me. Good luck with the series.
Thanks, man. Take care.